Okay, how many of you are familiar with the Daleks from Doctor Who? This is not a Doctor Who video, this is just a reference. So, the Daleks are very much based off of, to a degree, they are based off of certain German forces from World War II, we'll say. And that is fairly what they're based off, kind of the way that like the stormtroopers are based off of certain things in, Star Wars and stuff like that. The Daleks are a genetically modified race of creatures that were created, and they're basically a very gooey center inside of a very hard metal, very durable shell that they are able to control. And the Doctor is, of course, their main enemy, and they have been fighting for centuries upon centuries at this point in time, all throughout time and space and everything. And wherever you want to put it, the Daleks have possibly been there at some point in time in human history, and the Doctor has fought against them during that time frame. Various planets, whatever. There is a comic, and it's just a comic. It's a comic. It's a comic book that they made, and the name of the book was called The Only Good Dalek. And they did adapt this into a Doctor Who episode. I believe it's during Peter Capaldi's time as the Doctor. It is a Dalek that has basically grown a conscience because it is defective. Something in it is making it defective. And it has switched sides to a degree, and it has kind of turned itself in, and it has asked for the people that have it, that is just whatever variation humanity is at that point in time in the future, to bring it the Doctor, so that way the Doctor can figure out what is wrong with it, so that way the Doctor can then either use that to stop the other Daleks and either make them good or at the very least destroy them. And throughout the course of the episode / graphic novel, they end up succeeding to a degree. They figure out what's wrong with the Dalek, what's wrong with it, because it is a defective Dalek. It is a Dalek that does not want to kill and does not view itself as superior. And it ends up, they end up fixing it, and they do end up having to stop said Dalek, but they end up learning stuff about the Daleks. And it's this way of giving you sympathy for a group that pretty much throughout all of Doctor Who has just been nothing but fear and hated. Feared and hated, and just, all of that stuff. That has just always been the bad guy. And there's been other times in Doctor Who where the Daleks have turned to the Doctor for help. Asylum of the Daleks is a very good example of that. And there's been other Daleks that have been defective that has caused problems for the other Daleks and different things like that. But the reason I bring this up is because there is kind of a comparison to be made here, because throughout all of One Piece, ever since Sabaody, when we are fully introduced to what the Celestial Dragons are, this group, we are pretty much determined as a fan base to be like, oh, every time we see them, we're like, oh god, all of these ones are horrible, horrible people, less than people, even though they see themselves as above people. And we've seen that very clearly when it comes to Charlos and Roswald and the sister who I can never remember her name. And we've seen glimpses of good ones when it came to Homing and his wife and Roshanate and such. But the big one that we've seen that has been this example of one that starts off as the typical celestial dragon and changes is Saint Donquixote Mjosgard, which is who this video is about today, if you didn't figure that out already by the thumbnail and the title. And he is, of course, unfortunately, he's no longer alive in the manga, and the anime has not gotten to that part. And for a character that's only in a handful of chapters, and maybe by the end of it, beyond flashbacks, a grand total of maybe 7 episodes, 8 episodes by the time they get around to finishing up, showing what happened at the Reverie in the anime when we get to that. He's in probably less episodes than there are Straw Hats. And possibly less chapters than there are Straw Hats. flashbacks not included. But he has this very big impact on the fan base because he is this representation of this concept of just generational racism and just people who have been nothing but horrid to the other people of the world, and then they are shown compassion by the people that they were being horrible to, and this starts to make them change and starts to make them realize that maybe the way I've been viewing the world is wrong. And that is a representation, that is what Mjosgard, in my opinion, is supposed to represent. He is, of course, just like Doflamingo and Rocinante and Homing and the rest of the Doflamingo family. He is a descendant of, the original Don Quixote king from Dressrosa that joined the world government and helped form it and became the Celestial Dragon, 800 years ago and everything. He is a descendant of him. But I love the fact that for the Doflamingo family, or the Don Quixote family, Don Quixote family, that all of the ones who were good are dead. Doflamingo is still alive, and we don't know about Mjosgard's father. We don't know if Mjosgard's father is still alive, or if he's passed away since whatever, everything happened with Mjosgard and Fishman Island and everything. If he is still alive, he's probably quite ashamed of his son at this point in time, given everything that his son has done. But I like all the fact that the rest of the Celestial Dragons are just like, oh god, not them again. Oh god, that family. Yeah. So we see the shifts in Mjosgard's personality throughout the course of the flashbacks that we get for the story about Fisher Tiger and Queen Otohime in Fishman Island, when Jinbei is telling us about that. And then we get a much more full picture of him now in the anime and in the manga when we get to the Reverie, and then when we finally get to see the end of what happened at Reverie. And I think a lot of people, even before the chapters came out that revealed what happened for the rest of the Reverie, I think a lot of them were like, well, Mjosgard had to have been a part of what happened in some shape or form, in regards to whatever else happened with Shirahoshi, considering how devoted he had shown himself to be to protecting her and the rest of Neptune's family. So we have that. In regards to his actual history, by the way, I looked it up. We don't know his age. It's not stated. Given the way that he's drawn and the fact that he was, clearly full grown by the time everything happened in Fishman Island, and that was, 10 years ago, he is probably at least in his late 20s to early 30s, if not possibly into his 40s. But also, he went through a very radical internal change in regards to his, beliefs, and his core values were literally flipped because of Queen Otohime and such. So that can also do, a lot to a person. By the way, there are various accounts throughout history of people who have held very racist views, and then, just for generations upon generations in their family, or they themselves have had it, and then they're finally exposed to the group that they hate, and then they slowly start to realize that maybe this opinion I've been holding of them is wrong. Maybe I shouldn't be looking down on them just because of whatever reason. And that has had a lot of change throughout history. That shows that there are lots of people who are far and above, and Queen Otohime is a very good example of this, of people who are far and above just allowing the hatred to continue, of, just bouncing the hatred back and forth. But what ends up happening is we are introduced to Mjosgard during the Fishman Island flashback, and it is explained that he is this celestial dragon that is really no better than any of the other ones. He's tortured his slaves, branded them, laughed away as they are, beaten and tortured and done with whatever he wants, for his own amusement. The spoiled brat concept that we see with Charlos. Very much similar to that. And what ends up happening is, of course, this coincides when Jinbei becomes a warlord. And all of the fishermen slaves that were in Marijois at that time, mind you, at that time, were freed and sent back down to Fishman Island because of Jinbei becoming a warlord. And this is something that clearly, the five Gorosei were okay with doing, and possibly Im Sama was somewhat okay with it, depending on stuff, or maybe he would have been like, I care not for what has happened there, just leave me alone, leave me to my butterflies. And what happens is Mjosgard, in his, desire to get his slaves back, because he still views them as his own property, he travels from Marijois on this very ugly ship with a rat figurehead down to Fishman Island. And he's the only one of his crew to survive. And he gets there and he's, very badly injured and everything like that. And a bunch of the fishermen that were his former slaves, or family of his former slaves, show up, and because they would probably recognize his ship, because probably a lot of the different celestial dragons have like their own ship, depending on stuff, and they would probably recognize his ship, and they'd be like, oh god, not this again. And they show up at the harbor where he's, crashed, and they are full out ready to just shoot him because of, everything that he put them through, or put their family or friends through. And to a degree, most of the other fishermen there, and Neptune honestly included, probably wouldn't have blamed them. Jinbei probably wouldn't have blamed them in the first place, for all of that, considering what he knows from, Fisher Tiger at that point in time. And what ends up happening is, of course, they're ready to shoot him. And Otohime shows up. Queen Otohime shows up, and she puts herself between the two of them, between the angry fishmen, former slaves, and Mjosgard, and she defends him. And she's just, she gets shot in the process in her arm and everything, and they're just like terrified of the fact that they just shot their queen, because as much as sometimes they don't necessarily like what she's trying to do, they still very much adore and respect their queen, for the most part. Hody and some of the others being the exceptions to those rules. And Arlong is not there at this point in time. Although I don't know what Arlong would have thought of Queen Otohime. We never actually get that opinion, because he probably didn't really have any interaction with her at that point in time. But what ends up happening is, of course, Otohime tries to talk the rest of the fishermen slaves down from trying to attack him, and there's children here, they don't need to see this, they don't need to be witness to this perpetuation of hatred and fear and everything here, aiming back at him for what he did to you, yes, is understandable, but it's not going to end all of this bad stuff that keeps happening. It's not going to end the slavery. It's not going to end this, where the humans are terrified of us and see us as nothing but monsters from the deep and less than human. And she tries to talk them down, and I'll go much more into detail on that when I get to Otohime, when I go through the royal family of the Ryukyu Kingdom, when I get to that. But what ends up happening is, they kind of stop and they drop their weapons, and Mjosgard actually ends up grabbing his own gun and pointing it at her and using her as a hostage. However, Shirahoshi at this point in time cries out, and this results in, so many of the Sea Kings showing up, because she has activated her Poseidon powers for the first time at that point. And all of the Sea Kings show up, and they just start, they gobbled up his ship, and they're just, staring at him like, it's your move, boy. And he just kind of finally just stops and drops the gun and everything. And he's just, he's just loses consciousness and just passes out, and it's just like, oh good lord, and then passes out. Not that I blame him in the slightest. If that happened to me, and a bunch of giant Sea Kings popped up out of nowhere and were just like, hi, I'd be like, and now I'm fainting. Now I'm unconscious on the ground, and most likely a much more eatable snack. for the ones that wish to eat me. And what happens is, over the next several weeks, Mjosgard recovers while in Fishman Island, and he ends up, talking with Otohime and Neptune, and he decides that he will allow her to accompany him back to Marie-Joie, and under his, protection, to, take her back to Marie-Joie so that way she can speak to probably the Gorosei, because it wouldn't have been a reverie at that point in time, but probably to the Gorosei themselves and make her case to them, because 10 years ago there wouldn't have been a reverie. And it would have been either 12 years ago or 8 years ago, but, she travels up with him, and when she returns, she has the edict that would allow her, she kind of demands to accompany him, I should say, but he allows it. They travel up to Marie-Joie, where she probably, as I said, meets with the Gorosei, possibly, Figureland, Garing, possibly him, possibly any other of the high-ranking enough celestial dragons that actually pay attention to what's going on in the world. And she, argued her case in front of them, kind of like arguing your case in front of the Supreme Court to a degree. And they decided to allow it. Probably, Im Samba probably listened to some of it and, from his own little hidden area, and decreed that, yes, this is fine. Allow her to have this petition. And she returns with the petition that if she gets so many signatures from the people of Fishman Island, then they will work on trying to relocate Fishman Island up to the surface, so that way the humans and the fishmen and merfolk can all live together, coexist together. Harmony is asking a little bit much at this point in time, given stuff, but, that they can at least try to coexist together. And she returns to the Ryugu Kingdom with that option. Then, current timeline, when Shirahoshi and her father and brothers are up at Marie-Joie, which, in One Piece, it is very rare for Oda to just introduce a character that has a certain amount of significance and then never use them again. We haven't heard about Arlong in a very long time. Then again, I am one of the people that follows the theory that Arlong is at Marie-Joie, along with, Karubi and Chu and some of the other Arlong pirates that were there, and that they were turned into fishermen slaves, and we just haven't seen them since. I'm of that group, as is a lot of other people. And there's other ones that we just haven't seen for a long time. But what ends up happening is, of course, Oda didn't forget about him. Oda reintroduces Mjosgard. And we find out, what we end up seeing is that at the reverie, Charlo shows up with his giant slave, and he tries to have the slave, shackle Shirahoshi so that way he can then make her his slave, because he's a creep and a jerk and a slimy little scumbag. And he's trying to do that. And of course, Vivi and Rebecca are trying to help Shirahoshi, and then of course, CP Aijisiro shows up, and they're just like, oh, he's a celestial dragon, he can do whatever he wishes, because that is their right, and everything from Lucci. And then, out of nowhere, Giant Club Mallet shows up and whacks Charlos away from Shirahoshi, and then and then it's revealed that this is Donquixote Mjosgard, who, the Ryugu Kingdom, the royal family, have not heard anything about in the last 10 years. I haven't any contact with him. I haven't heard anything from him in the last 10 years. And, he gets, he knocks out Charlos, and then Charlos gets carried away by his slave, and Shirahoshi is okay. And Mjosgard explains to Neptune that over the last 10 years, because of the interaction that I had with your wife, because of, watching her interact with her own people, and then, spending time with her on the way back up to Marie-Joie, probably. Although we do get this in the flashback, and I don't remember if this is specifically in the manga or if it's just something they added in the anime, when she's getting on the ship, he actually like glares at her off to the side while all of her people are waving at her, wishing her goodbye. He's like glaring at her because he's still disgusted with her at that point in time, because he still just sees her as nothing more than like, yeah, you might be the queen of these wretched creatures, but you're still so far beneath me. But during all of that, and probably listening to her give her speech or whatever that she gave to Gorosei, Celestial Dragons, whatever, over time, over the next 10 years, which is a long time, but over that time frame, he starts to realize that she's right. That the way that I have been treating my slaves is abhorrent. The way that all of us celestial dragons have treated our slaves and treated the rest of the world for the past 800 years is abhorrent and is just, unforgivable. And he, like Homing, who previously did this, he declares himself to be human. He does not give up his title as a celestial dragon, though. And he's explaining this to Neptune and to the princes. Shirahoshi's off to the side being healed, but she's also like listening in on the conversation and such. And along with the other bunch of the other allies that they have at that point in time are like part of the conversation. And, he's explaining that because of your wife, because of what Otohime said, and then probably finding out about her death, because he was probably somewhat informed about her death when she was assassinated by Horty, that also may have helped with attributing the rest of his change, Because we find out from Roswell later that Mjosgard has freed his slaves and has ones that are actually employees instead of slaves, or they are actually paid, and where he, has probably bought up slaves from other celestial dragons and like freed them himself, and either found ways to send them home as best as possible, or had them become employees within his own home, within his own household. Which is why I say that his father is most likely dead. I don't think we'll ever get an answer about the father, whether or not his father is still alive or not. But otherwise, well, maybe we'll see what happens. Maybe if that's a question someone asks in an SBS of like, hey, is Donquixote Mjosgard's father, the one that looks like a rat, is he still alive? That looks like a botched naked mole rat experiment. Is he still alive? And if so, what is his opinion on what happened with his son? His son's actions, and then resulting in his son being executed and everything. So, what's his opinion on that? That would be a good SBS question. But what ends up happening is, Mjosgard has explained to Neptune, and he even gets down on his knees and he apologizes for what happened with Charlo, for the fact that Charlo's even got anywhere near Shirahoshi in order to attempt such a thing. And he's just, he is repentant about that, and he is like, I know that I can't do too much, but I can at least provide protection for yourself and your children for while you are here, and I will, help protect all of you with as much as with my power to the best of my abilities and everything. And, Leo is just like, so does that mean that we can attack someone if they try to attack Shirahoshi? And he's like, yeah, you better, that's, you do that and I'll take responsibility and everything. And so we see about all of that. And then eventually we know that, Mjosgard probably stayed around Shirahoshi for the rest of, stuff as best he could. I know that some people think that maybe he was part of like the talks that were going on for, the reverie with all the monarchs and everything, but I'm like, we never saw him in there. So my thought is that he stayed with Shirahoshi, because she is technically the most vulnerable out of them, because the princes can all fight back, and even though she can summon the Sea Kings, she's all the way up in frickin' Marijois, and unless somehow Zunisha shows up, talks with the Sea King, and then like picks the Sea King up and throws it at Marijois because it hears Shirahoshi's cry, I don't see a way of a Sea King finding its way to Marie Joie very easily. Although that would be exceedingly hilarious to watch, of like Zunisha just like having a line of Sea Kings already of like with like helmets on their heads, like, okay, we're ready for you to throw us at Marie Joie. We're gonna go save our princess. Like Zunisha there. Bing! 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 Just like sending Sea Kings flying at Marie Joie. Oh god, I want to see that now. It's like attempting that. And like, okay, we're gonna make a giant Sea King rope for all of us to climb up here and get to Shirahoshi because she's in trouble. That would be hilarious to watch. I don't know how feasible that is, but that would be hilarious to watch. But oh god, now I'm gonna have that image in my head for a while. But my thought is that Mjosgard just kind of stays near where Shirahoshi is and where like Vivi and Rebecca are and stuff like that. To like just keep an eye on them and everything as best as possible and to protect Shirahoshi, because we do know that later on Charlo shows back up again, and again he's attempting to enslave Shirahoshi, and Mjosgard telling Sai and Leo that they have permission to strike down Charlos. This resulted, of course, them showing up, and they clobber Charlos on the head and turn his head into an accordion. Yeah, Charlos should be very dead at this point in time. And he's not, but he should be. Because Charlos and Mjosgard are kind of these dueling setups for the fact of Charlos is this representation of like, no matter how hard you try, you can't really beat racism out of people. And Mjosgard is this representation of like, sometimes with compassion involved, you can find a way to help people find their way out of that darkness that they are in, that is racism and sexism and whatever else, and that with the right compassion and the right interaction you can lead them out of it and help them become a better human. And so Mjosgard has Sai and Leo permission to attack Charlos, which they do, and they save Shirahoshi and everything. And of course we now know that Charlos commanded Kuma to attack Charlos, Roswald, whichever one, commanded Kuma to attack Mjosgard. And Sai and Leo attack Charlos, and then this is when Morley shows up, grabs Kuma and drags Kuma away, so that way Kuma's not going to be hurt. And we end up then finding out at the a little before the break happened, we found out that okay, there was an execution. They had brought in the Holy Knights, God's Knights, and a trial was held among the Celestial Dragons for an attempted murder. And what ends up happening is, a lot of us thought, oh, maybe it's, Sai and Leo for attempting to assassinate Charlos, or maybe it's something else. And we're like, a lot of us are like, no, it's probably Mjosgard. And I don't think we thought that they would take it, that, the God's Knights would take it to the extreme that they did. Because we probably all thought, or a lot of us probably thought that, oh, they'll just like banish him from Marie Joie because they can't think of any worse punishment than having to go and live in the lower realm amongst the rabble and everything, that they can't think of anything that would be worse than that. We were wrong. For those of us that thought that, we were wrong. And it is revealed that Garing Figureland, who is the head of the God's Knights, most likely Shanks' father, grandfather, or uncle, depending on stuff, that it is revealed that Mjosgard was executed. And that the sentence has been carried out, and we actually kind of see that in the manga. We see him, strung up kind of on the world government cross, and crucified, basically, for all intents and purposes, and then probably shot multiple times to make sure that he was dead. And we don't quite know the reverberations for what this will cause, for what this will mean, because that information probably will not be released to the press Although, admittedly, it does sound like a story that Morgans would be quite interested in getting his hands on, but I don't see Morgans actually printing it with everything else that's going on here, with Egghead and Lelucia disappearing into the giant ocean hole, and, you know, everything else that's happening with that. I don't see Morgans necessarily printing that as like the cover page of anything unless he finds out about it. But the thing is, everything happened with Cobra and Sabo and all of that, so that was what he printed. So maybe he would. But there's also the thing of like, I don't know how much of that information would get out of Marie Joie. And it may not be, Shirahoshi and Neptune may not find out about that until later on, find out that he was executed later on. I can see Shirahoshi being upset about it, and I can see even Neptune being like, they would even do that to one of their own. Our people just are not safe with them, no matter what. So we don't know what the reverberations of that are going to be. I have stated this before, and I will continue to state it. Given the fact that the Celestial Dragons, as a group, have been around for 800 some years at this point in time, and we've really only seen a handful of examples of those who ended up forming some form of like human compassion, and all of them were from the Doflamingo family at this point in time. I am not going to be surprised if it is revealed that there are some other ones who actually have compassion. They just have seen from watching what happens to other people, to other celestial dragons, that either give up their celestial dragon power and move to, move down to the lower realm or whatever, that they have learned to just hide the way that they do things and try to do better and just say, oh no, I killed that slave, when in actuality they freed the slave and found a way to get the slave back to their home. Or some variation of it. So I don't know exactly. Mjosgard cannot be like the one good celestial dragon that was left and is now dead. I don't like that concept, but I'm not going to be surprised if that's where Oda goes with it, and depending on how he plays it, considering that most of the other celestial dragons we've seen are just the entitled, pompous, windbag, racist representation that they are. And if it is revealed that yes, there are possibly other good celestial dragons or other celestial dragons that have the capacity to be good, I would like for Oda to highlight those, because those are also an important part of, the story and this representation of having like a fully fleshed out group to have this, show. In that regard, that's about all that we get there. For some trivia about Mjosgard, his, kind of his introduction is very much believed to be based around like the fugitive slave laws from the United States, where it was if slaves ran away, slave owners were allowed to go and reclaim the slaves as long as they could provide proof of ownership. That's very much what that was representing. Mjosgard is the only member of the Doflamingo family, of the Donquixote family, that we have seen that does not have blonde hair. All the rest of them have blonde hair, including his father. He has green hair. And of course, he's the second one of the family to, declare himself as human. And of course, his name is a combination of Mjolnir, which is Thor's hammer, and then Asgard, which is of course one of the 9 realms where Thor is from, if anybody pays attention to Marvel, like I do. So his name is a portmanteau of those. That may have been a clue, when he's first introduced. That may have been a clue that he was going to end up actually being a good character, and Oda may have just planned that from the beginning with him when he was first introduced in the Fishman Island flashback by Jinbei. That may have been planned. And it's just like, okay, I'm going to give him this name that is like this realm of glory, this realm of warriors and everything, which is Asgard. And then Mjosgard, or Mjolnir, which is this hammer that can only be lifted by one who is worthy. And, he may have planned that from the beginning as this representation of what Mjosgard was going to represent, that he was someone who, well, started out as not a good character, has gone through the painful internal process of going through this internal transformation and becoming a good character. And we even see that in the way that he looks at the beginning in the flashback when we first see him with the very snub, pompous, smug type of thing, as opposed to what we see him at Reverie. So there is that difference there. So that's what I have. I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I think the next one I will be doing, because I'm not going to do one about every single one of the different celestial dragons. Mjosgard I just wanted to highlight. Probably the next one I will be doing for these rulers of the world will be the Gorosei. And we'll see how that plays out given certain things that are going on at Egghead Island at the moment. We'll see what happens there. So that's what I have. I thank you for watching, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye.